a moral system that's based on a belief in a higher power. That said, I think we're talking about Confucianism tonight, and so all bets are off.
All right. Well, does anyone else have any suggestions? That's a good answer.
I was thinking about a structure of beliefs, but I think there is a difference between spirituality and religion. Religion, to me, sets up a whole. For some, it's a set of rules.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to mute this and go in.
Okay. No worries. Would anyone else like to add?
I think a religion is tied up in a community. It's a way to get together with a community that may share common beliefs or culture.
Okay, so I'm hearing higher power, community, shared beliefs. Those are all very good answers. I think a lot of people would agree with that. I mean, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but sometime I'd like to have a separate class on the origin of where the idea of religion came from in the first place. You know, when did people start using that term, and why, what applied, what didn't. But we'll get to that another time. What I kind of want you all to think about a little bit as we're going through this is, to some extent, whether these traditions that we talk about are religions in your view, and whether it even matters if they're religions or not. Just kind of think about a little bit of that. You know, are they a philosophy? Are they a culture? Are they a religion? Just as we go. All right, so I'm just these are just kind of some random facts that I want to make sure that people know a little bit about before we kind of go into the information here. One is that China is the third largest country geographically, the largest population. It holds 20% of the world's population. People from China are rural, they're urban. They have specific ethnic identities within being Chinese. There's a lot of diversity, and no matter what I say here, there's going to be exceptions. Just like any religion, to be honest, but maybe even more so with how large and diverse China can be. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind. Also, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the circumstances of the Uyghur Muslim population today, but I do want you all to know that the Uyghurs are an ethnic group in China, and most of them are Muslim. And they are being persecuted by the Chinese government. And it's one of the biggest reasons, and it sounds silly, one of the biggest reasons is because they don't eat pork, which is seen as a very fundamental part of being Chinese. Pork is such an important national cuisine that the government actually sees that as, anti-Chinese, right? That's not the only thing, but they're put in work camps, and there's just a lot of bad things going on with the Uyghur Muslims, but that could be all its own conversation. I encourage you to look into news articles about that if you're interested. Also want to mention China is very different from other countries in East Asia. I'm just talking about China today, although China definitely influences some of the countries around it. And then also, all the traditions, except for the last one that we're going to talk about, are from a time period that we call the Axial Age. And if any of you have read Karen Armstrong's book, The Great Transformation, that book is about the Axial Age. It's basically about 1000 BC to 200-ish BC. There's a lot of things in common with a lot of religions around that time, in particular about the responsibility of the individual to the community, which is something that doesn't have the same power before that age. Before that age, it's all about the community and then Axial Age introduces the responsibility of the individual. And then there's Shen, which is the god of heaven. It's a term, and this is going to pop up. It's kind of in the background of all these religions. Different traditions interpret it differently, but the most common way is that the god of heaven is very abstract. It's kind of an all-encompassing deity that includes, includes everything you see and everything you don't see. And then this deity has different forms kind of based off of the traditions that you are looking at specifically. Does that make sense? Any questions about any of that? All right. So the four traditions we're going to talk about a little bit today. And I do want to mention that I would be happy to do a class on each of these individually even. But I do think it's very important to understand how these four are connected, because particularly in China, these don't have clear separations all the time. So, I want to introduce you a little bit to all of them before making it feel like they're all separate, if that makes sense. So the way that I think about it is Taoism is sort of a religion of the universe. It kind of gives you teachings about what your relationship is with the universe. Confucianism often gives you the teachings of how to interact with your family or with your government or with your society. It has a lot to do with the everyday. The Buddhism, which tends to tell you how to live yourself. If you were in a bubble, what would be your responsibilities? And then the folk religion, which is not my favorite term because it kind of makes it sound backwoodsy, and I don't intend for it to, but this doesn't really have a name. A lot of the time it's just kind of called being part of being Chinese, and that often has to do with sort of the everyday life of people and the state of being Chinese. And we're going to continue to move on here and start with Taoism. So Taoism is a little closer to how you would pronounce it in Chinese. Taoism is the same thing, but it's just another way to say it. And it literally translates to the way or the path or the road. And the Tao is the way. And it literally translates that way. So, and I don't mean to be too confusing here, but the Tao can be part of other traditions too. Taoism is a specific religious point of view, and you can have sort of a Tao of almost anything, right? It's the way of being, and Taoism is taking a specific approach to being and making it a little more religious. So Taoism was actually founded in about 600 BC. It's probably the second oldest of the religions that we're going to talk about. But the books that influence it and the people that influence it come from hundreds of years before. Lao Tzu is probably the most well-known, the author of the Tao Te Ching. How many of you own a Tao Te Ching? Do any of you? So I would encourage it if you're interested in learning about Taoism. I think that's the most straightforward way to learn about it, is to read the most popular text itself. It's not very large. I actually have a copy here. Here's a little copy, Tao Te Ching. This was just a penguin one. It's got a lot of sayings from Lao Tzu, and I'm going to go into a few quotes by him in a couple of slides here. And I also want to make sure that you know that the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching are two different books. They often get confused. The I Ching is actually very old. We don't know exactly how old it is. It's probably in, like 1200 or so years old. And that one's a little bit more, it's more used for like fortune telling and things like that. And the Tao Te Ching is a little more quotes to live by. All right. And this graphic over here is how you write the Tao in Chinese character. All right, so most of you have seen this yin yang symbol, and this is both important in the West to people who understand Tao as well as people in China. So most of you have seen this, right? Yeah. So yin is all the dark on this, and yang is all the whiteness on this. And the yin yang symbol really does symbolize a lot of the religion. So what do you notice about this yin yang symbol? Anyone want to shout out anything that you notice about it?
They're connected and appear to be rotating.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, so it looks cyclical, and they are not separate from one another. Anything else?
Each is interrupted by that small circle, right? It's not a complete swath of its kind, its color.
Right, that's true.
They look exactly opposite.
Yep. So equal and reflective, have a little piece of each other in each one. It's a circle. I think. Do you want me to unmute you? I think you. Okay. So yeah, all that's true. So we have two equal parts, right? That are part of a cycle. Being in one circle kind of signifies unity of sorts, right? That they are one thing in a sense, made up of two things which are somewhat separated. And those little pieces are basically symbolize that there's always a little bit of the opposite in everything, right? Mm-hmm. So everything that has darkness has a bit of light in it. Everything that has heat has a bit of cold in it. There's no 100% one side of this. So, as you see on my list here, yin is black, dark, feminine, the moon, liquids, earth, cool, and yang is, white, bright, masculine, sun, solid, sky, warm. So there's definitely an understanding that there are many, many opposites in the world, but they come together to create the world around us. That there is some level of balance and cycle and harmony to opposites, and they need each other to continue that balance. I also just want to mention that, in our last class, we had Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastrianism also has this dualism, right? But in Zoroastrianism, they don't believe that there's overlap. They believe that it's either black or it's white. It's either dark or light. All right, here, sorry. Let's see. All right, did anyone have any questions about the last one or anything? So here's a few quotes from the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I'll just read them out loud. I'll read one and then I'll pass it on here. Being deeply loved by someone gives you strength, while loving someone deeply gives you courage. Would anyone like to read the second one?
Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. Then I lose it. What? Sorry, I can't read it. The pictures are in the way. That you have nothing lacking. The whole world belongs to you.
Mm-hmm. would anyone like to read the third one?
He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough.
That one's one of my favorites. It just sounds cute. So this one of the most important concepts, I would say, that is not really clearly defined in the yin yang symbol or these quotes, is the Wu Wei. And this is a very important to Taoism. It's a very important teaching in Eastern philosophies and religions in general. So Wu Wei is it's kind of combining being in the present with doing things naturally. Lao Tzu really believes that you should get to a point where doing good things is just a reflex, right? Like it's something that you just do. You don't have to think about. You know, you might find in other religions that it's very, very important to know why you do good things and all those things. But with Taoism, it is different. There are good things to do, and you should do them in the present very naturally. That is the key to Taoism, is to be in that state of mind, if you will, of basically no mind in a sense. So yeah, does anyone have any questions about Taoism? Because I'm going to go to the next tradition.
See, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So how popular is this currently in China?
So there's a lot of ways to answer that. It's in the single digits of people who call themselves Taoists. But I think we'll get to some of that later in the slideshow. The size of all these traditions are not quite the easiest thing to measure, because a lot of people practice teachings from something but don't necessarily identify themselves as practicing the religion. So Taoism, and actually all of these traditions, in some sense, something that's very different about Asian countries in general, but China especially, is that most of these religions have a clearer line between the clergy, if you will, and the laity. That's not the best way to describe it for China, but basically we have two groups of people who practice Taoism, right? We have people who work in temples, and then we have people who, go about their daily lives and they go to the temple often. They practice the religion almost completely differently from each other, and this is true for Buddhism in China generally. This is true for Confucianism in general. So you have, I would like to sort of say it's kind of like Catholicism if you were to not have churches. If you were to only have monasteries and schools and the ability to visit monasteries, I would say that a lot of these religious traditions are practiced in that way. You don't have like as many traditional services, and of course there's many exceptions, but you don't have as many traditional services as you would like with a church or a synagogue or a mosque. Does that help? There's probably more information than necessary. All right, so
Jeremy,
yeah.
that makes me think about what they've been talking about recently, about how one of the most important functions of church or synagogue or whatever is that we get together, we're in relationship with each other, and that we do things within that church together. Does that exist then in these religions?
There's always exceptions, and especially with how large these traditions in this country is. But the average person does not, I would not say, goes to the temple for community. They go to do the rituals that they intend to do, you know, that are part of the year or part of family tradition, and then they go home and they have communities, you know, in their towns with their neighbors and other things like that. That's how I understand it. And if I mean, if anyone else has experienced it differently, let me know. But that is that's how I've read it. Yeah. So let's go on to Confucianism. So he can be called Confucius. He can be called Kung Fu Tzu. He can be called Kong Chu. These are all valid. Kong Chu is closer to how Chinese people say it. The others are, you know, translations and ways to say it in like English or Latin. And then there's Mencius as well. So most people interpret Confucius as being around in the 6th and 5th century BC, and probably being pretty well versed on Taoism. A lot of what he does is see Taoism and sort of critique it, if you will, and apply certain things and maybe reduce the importance of others. Part of Chinese history is this long history of war, if you will, between different schools of thought. Some we would consider religious, some we would consider political, some we would consider philosophical. But you have these groups that want to have power and create different dynasties of rule. Confucius, during his life, he really wanted to be an advisor to a king. That's what he really wanted to do with his life. And he lived his whole life not being able to find anyone who would have him as an advisor. But his strategy was to get basically some disciples, some students. And I believe the tradition is that he taught about 100, if I remember right. And those people were much more effective at spreading a lot of the philosophical and religious teachings of Confucius. Some people say Mencius is one of those disciples. You can look both Confucius and Mencius up for their books that they've written that have impacted a lot of Confucian thought. So the reason I also put Neo-Confucianism here is because there's a time basically between the founding of it and between the start of Neo-Confucianism that it almost dies. You know, it gets the ideas get attacked by some other competing schools of thought, and eventually what ends up happening is you have Taoism growing in strength, as well as Buddhism eventually gets into China. And because of those things, they start comparing to older schools of thought, and Confucianism starts adopting a few of the ideas from Buddhism and Taoism to create kind of a newer form of it, a form that was meant for the 9th century and beyond. And this is one statue of Confucius. Not every temple has a statue of Confucius, but some do. Did I skip him? No. Okay, so there's 5 virtues in Confucianism: benevolence, ritual propriety, which basically means to do proper ritual, wisdom, integrity, and righteousness. With these 5 virtues, what would you expect Confucianism to be critiquing or criticizing?
Society.
Okay. In what way?
How the people interact with one another, etc.
Okay.
Especially if you're looking at integrity and righteousness and benevolence, that's how we interact with other people that we may live with or around.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Is there anything missing from here in your view that, or in anyone's view, that you would consider a virtue that is definitely not represented by any of those five?
Don't you think that righteousness is kind of a big umbrella there?
I mean, that's true. That's very true. Well, I will move on, and I'll kind of come back to these five virtues a little bit in the next one. So,
Sorry, faithful isn't on there.
Okay, that's true. There's an insistence on doing the ritual properly, but not necessarily an importance of respecting the divine, unless you consider righteousness that. But I think most people think of righteousness as how they act, right?
I'm wondering if trust, just if that was inherent in one of the words that was there or not. Maybe an integrity or righteousness. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah. So I'll go into a little bit more detail of ritual propriety and filial piety really quick. And then I'll kind of explain what some of the things that he critiqued that you wouldn't necessarily expect people to critique today. So we have filial piety. Okay, so I have a quote here. He who loves his parents does not dare to do evil unto others. He who respects his parents does not dare to be arrogant to others. So what do you notice about that?
Well, the focus is on, on the parent and the relationship to the parents.
Right.
Reflecting their values or whatever it is that, yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's basically the golden rule, but parents, but so filial piety is definitely the most important part of Confucianism. It's that society has this family unit, right? That's just and this is a conservative philosophy in many ways. Okay, so there's kind of a father, mother, son, daughter, and in particular, Confucianism is talking about the father and son relationship. That the father has a responsibility to protect their children, but maybe what's even more important to Confucius is that the children respect their elders, and there's many, many ways to do that. Filial piety basically means, that that the family is the religion, that your interaction with the family is how you sort of see the sacred. And most Confucian teachers expand this to also reflecting like the government and society. So the government is sort of the father figure of society, and the society should be pious toward the government, that you should continue to honor your ancestors, and really it reaches worship of ancestors. There's sacrifices and things like that, which we'll get to a little bit later as well in the folk religion section. But the ancestors are so important.
I see a real weakness in that.
Okay. How do you see a weakness in that?
Because not all parents are that great. and some people are orphans, and they're raised by, and everybody knows they're raised by people who are not their parents.
Okay.
and because their parents were gone, they're missing. Who knows?
Yeah.
Drug addicts or something.
I mean that's that's a very good point. I actually have not read a whole lot about how Confucius might have responded to orphans or anything along those lines. That's a very good point.
Well, I can see translating that the father to the government and that, but the government is always a collection of a lot of people,
Right.
and they're trying to uphold some sense of values. But in a family, it's just within the walls of that house.
Right.
Right. A lot of times anything can happen.
Yeah, no, for sure. I know it's not perfect. There's a lot of responsibility on the child in this philosophy, and that is in part because Confucius thought that if everyone did that, then people would be taken care of. If everyone took care of their parents, it's in like American, European society in particular, it's a little more the other direction. But you can see why they might make that argument. That you like there's a story about how Confucius was asked what to do. My father stole a sheep. What should I do? And he basically says, well, cover for him, basically. So,
Really?
Yeah, I mean that's basically what he says. So, so that's definitely filial piety, and it applies beyond the parents, the father, to grandparents, etc. as well. That you should continue to do the rituals that you're meant to do, and that leads into ritual propriety.
Sir, can I ask a question, Jeremy? Is there a relation to like the Trinity version of Father in terms of Father, deity, Father?
Yeah.
Do you mean like from?
I mean, where Christianity went
Right.
next, right? So, I mean, it's just like, is there a tie between that Father, godly Father, that we, that people use the word Father for Lord, right?
Right. So, I mean, I think if I'm understanding what you're saying, that kind of the worship of God the Father is sort of like this, but maybe at a macro scale. Is that right?
That's the question. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that. So I think that there is some similarity to that. If you believe that your responsibility as a Abrahamic religion in general, really, anyone who interprets God as God the Father would be able to see how if you believe your responsibility is to respect and serve the Father as parent, then I think that there's some level of that. But Confucius definitely emphasized it at the family level, and there is also some of that in Abrahamic religion as well. That there's quite a few teachings about honor your father and mother, right? So it's not totally different, but it's definitely emphasized in a way that is not comparable, even in some ways, to Abrahamic religions. So back to these 5 virtues. One of these 5 virtues is doing the ritual properly. Okay, and maybe to back up just a little bit further. So a few things that I notice that about these 5 virtues is, are any of these forward thinking? Are any of these truly future minded? One thing about Confucianism is a deep love and respect for the past, and tradition, holding up traditions, holding up your ancestors, remembering the history. There's no interest really in, or very little interest in creativity, for example, because wisdom and knowing that history, knowing those facts, is much more important than ingenuity in Confucianism. So the ritual propriety is kind of part of like just keep the tradition, right? And one of the stories that I think is kind of funny is Confucius was asked, because there was some criticism of some of the sheep sacrificing that was going on during his era, and one of his followers asked him, what should we do? And his response was, "You love the sheep, I love the ceremony." That, I'm sorry, but the tradition is much more important than the sheep, is basically what he's saying. And that is very important for Confucianism, and it has dramatically influenced Chinese culture. So the main practices, I'll go into this later, but Confucianism is actually officially not considered a religion in China. We can talk about that a little more later. But they do have temples. They do have rituals. They do have some level of community. And the thing that they're most famous for is Confucian schools. Confucian schools were the dominant form of public or private education for 1,000 years. Only in the last 100 years did they move away from schools being almost entirely Confucian. And there was a very strict curriculum of learning Confucian ethics and morals and values. And then you would take a test at the largest Confucian temple. And how well you did could determine where you would sit in Chinese government if you did really, really well, and if you didn't do very well, then you'd probably go home to be a farmer. But in a sense, there's some meritocracy in those schools to government position pipeline situations.
Jeremy, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that like the state almost is a father type of relationship. This, in my mind, I'm going, it sounds real familiar now that the state is trying to grant points to people, how well you do, how well you follow the rules, what a good, Chinese citizen you are. And that kind of rings in the back of my head with this.
Oh, for sure. The Chinese government and the president specifically often talk about how they are responsible for the morality and actions of their citizens, again, in a way that I think is different from Western countries in general. This is kind of a side note, but it makes sense in the context. So one practice, and this is kind of a practice that is not clear what tradition it completely comes from. There's a practice at funerals, particularly in Southwest China, to have entertainment. And that entertainment can include comedians, strippers, drinking, things that we would consider obscene in like the United States a lot of the time. And the government has tried to crack down on a lot of, strippers at cemeteries, which they consider unseemly, but particularly rural Chinese people feel is very important. You're bringing in more people to give your ancestor, if you will, a good send-off. You're balancing the Tao, if you will, between life and death, like sexuality and total absence of sexuality. So, it's very important to a lot of those rural communities, but China has taken it upon themselves to be the father figure in that situation. All right. So I am not going to go into that much detail on Buddhism. It's its own class, its own course, its own life, if you want it to be, because it just became so big and made all these schools of thought that there just is no comparison to the size of Taoism and Confucianism. But I do want to mention this because it is a large religion in China. And so Buddhism came last of these four traditions, somewhere between 200 BC and 200 CE. Most people say that it was probably through trade, that trade from India came up and they eventually adopted Buddhism as well. And the two main teachings that I want to go through, and I'm sure many of you have heard of them, are the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. These are highly influential anywhere where there's Buddhism. But you can see how these might connect with the other traditions that we've discussed, and how they answer other questions that the other traditions don't answer. So the Four Noble Truths is very, very simple in many ways, that we know that in life we suffer. There is suffering in life. And that the Buddha taught that suffering is from desiring things, desiring anything really, desiring power, desiring money, desiring things, desiring happiness. Ending desire is how you end suffering. And to end this desire, to end this suffering, you have to follow the Eightfold Path, which is to do things right, to have right understanding, intent, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And I want to mention again that I think our next class will be about Buddhism, just because I think it's important for us to get to the details of Buddhism beyond this. But I do want to mention this as part of Chinese culture specifically. This picture here is of a laying Buddha, which is often a symbol of the end of the life for that Buddha. All right. So the folk religion of China, there isn't really an accepted name for this this tradition, if you will. It has probably been around longer than the rest of these, but it is a very malleable tradition that is able to accept different deities, different teachings, and it can be practiced alongside any of these others. A lot of people will call it the tradition of gods, ghosts, and ancestors. That's basically because this is where, if you learn about Chinese mythology in any sense, it probably has its roots in this folk tradition. And again, this folk tradition, it comes before Taoism, comes before Buddhism, comes before Confucianism. So the gods are a wide variety of gods. There are gods for everything, and that's because that the divine is present right here, right now, in everything. Going back to what I mentioned earlier in the slides, Shen, the god of heaven, takes many aspects. There's some similarities here with Hinduism, if you remember. Takes many aspects, and these gods, like I said, there's a god for everything. The two gods that are shown here are actually Guan Yin and the Jade Emperor. So on the right, we have the Jade Emperor, and that is one of the oldest deities in China. And it's basically the god of royalty. he is actually in charge of much of the various myths in Chinese mythology, including the myth of the zodiac. You've all been to Chinese restaurants and seen the menus that often have the zodiac years and signs, all the different animals. There's a mythological story about that, and I'm happy to send you a copy of that. Basically, that there's a race between these animals that's put on by the Jade Emperor, and there's a story as to why the order is the way it is, why the rat comes in first place and the pig comes in last place. And going back over to Guan Yin. So Guan Yin is a god in Chinese mythology. She is also a bodhisattva, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for, but it's a very important figure in Buddhism. Okay, Guan Yin is there. Guan Yin also will often change gender depending on the story. There aren't tons and tons of characters like this in particularly Abrahamic traditions, but Guan Yin is probably most popular as a woman, or an androgynous character. So in China, you can see Guan Yin at almost any type of temple. Interestingly enough, she probably is, at least in my view, she's probably an ancient deity goddess who was adopted into the traditions of later religions. As you know, she was formerly one of the head goddesses, and she still is seen as one of the most popular, one of the most powerful, one of the most well-known deities in China. And this specific statue is of her as a bodhisattva from Buddhism. She's symbolizing her willingness to get up, to move into action, which is an important part of Guan Yin, that she does things, right? She doesn't just meditate. She goes up and moves. She goes places. She is an action hero in the stories, if you will. All right, so there's a lot of practices in China that don't necessarily fit in sort of the origins of Taoism, Buddhism, or Confucianism. They were clearly around for a long time before these traditions, because Confucius is saying that we should be doing these rituals properly, and he's referring to rituals that already exist. Some of these are gravestone sweeping, which I sent you all a video in the original invitation of a gravestone sweeping ceremony that happened just about a month ago. They've had to do some social distance versions of that. Normally you would physically travel to the cemetery to physically sweep the gravestone. But interestingly enough, during the coronavirus, you see people like live streaming the gravestones, which doesn't happen normally, and maybe paying people to sweep the gravestone, and all the same arguments that you hear here, like how about just families going, right? Or limiting the number of people who go, or what if we stand 10 feet apart? A lot of those same arguments are being made about a lot of these folk practices in particular, because in many ways they are more important. in some sense than the other traditions daily practice. So on the right here, on the bottom right, you see altars, an altar. So on here you see an altar that probably, I don't know for sure, probably has the name of a loved one. That's pretty common on these altars. And then you've also got food and flowers, which an important part of this Chinese folk religion is that, in the afterlife, the ancestors need a lot of the same things as they did in normal life. They need flowers. Well, they don't need flowers. They like flowers in the afterlife. They need to eat. So you have to sacrifice it, and it basically has a spiritual reflection, if you will, in the afterlife of your ancestors. And that's also the same as this top thing. And I am disappointed I couldn't find mine, but there's these very cheap and very easy to purchase ancestor money. So you take this money and light it on fire and put it in your altar, which you might see here, this bowl here. You might light something on fire and allow it to turn to ash in there. And the idea is that you are able to sort of give that money to your ancestor in the afterlife, and they know that this money is not able to be used in China. This is not Chinese currency. This is the money that they use in the afterlife. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and that's, like I said, that's true for all of these. So what your ancestors would want is what they would want. And just to kind of go, yeah.
How expensive is the money? What kind of, how much do people put into this?
Very cheap. So I was looking it up online earlier, and you could buy, 50 of these pieces of paper for like $8.
Oh.
It's not that expensive. It's very, very, very common. You'll see this type of money at burials. It'll be sacrificed. It will be, given it, dropped at the grave site. Just whatever makes sense to try to give that money to the ancestor in the afterlife. And like I said, the same kind of holds true for food. It holds true for a lot of things that you would need in normal life. Families often, especially in rural communities, often have a kind of an outdoor altar to ancestors. Sometimes the grave sites are right there, and in Confucianism, Confucius teaches that really children should not move very far from their parents. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons is because they have a responsibility to continue to give for their parents in the afterlife, whether that's to sweep the gravestones, whether that's to give food or money. They have to be there to some extent to do it right, to do the right thing for their parents. And it's difficult when you live in the United States, for example. So a lot of people are having some family conflict about that. So the ghost piece from this other one, that is often both ghosts, gods, ghosts, and ancestors can actually all be formerly ancestors. Ghosts are often angry, and gods are often often distant, actually. And then ancestors are ones that can maybe help you in some way. So your ancestors could theoretically become, new deities, or become ghosts, or be just kind of having a fairly normal life in the afterlife. And part of that is that, especially in these rural communities, you have sometimes possession, and often it can be either a god or a ghost usually. And the tradition is that if the god or the ghost needs to speak to someone, an ancestor of some kind needs to speak to someone, they, would take over a person and kind of speak through them, right? I've seen some videos and some things like that of this. A lot of the time there's an expectation that you would speak in a different tone, right? You would maybe speak with a different accent. There's things that you would be able to tell which god or which ghost or which ancestor has possessed the person. Okay. That's not practiced by all of China or anything like that. But the rural communities in particular continue a lot of the ancient folk practices. And kind of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these folk religious practices are like combined in some way. It's not seen as separate from Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism. It's not really even seen as religious. It's seen as being part of being Chinese and part of being in China, that you participate in these folk practices. And there's a particular emphasis on the community with that. So like certain deities might have an extra presence in this rural community, while others might be more important to other rural communities, just because of a shared history of that community with that deity. Does anyone have any questions about those folk practices or anything to comment on?
Are the folk practices tied to places? Like if someone's from the West or from the East or South or North, are there certain ancestors or gods connected with the places?
There's a bit of both. There's kind of sort of like the more powerful the god is, or the more powerful the ghost is, the further they could be from where they originated, if that makes sense. So like Guan Yin or the Jade Emperor are going to be, they are deities of all of China. You don't have to be anywhere in particular for them, although it would probably be good to be in a temple that has them. But there are definitely, gods of this creek, right? This creek that's just outside the village. That's got a deity that is important, that doesn't really leave the creek. That an ancestor may not leave the property that they died on. Again, like I said, this gets complicated because sometimes, you might pray to an ancestor, and if the ancestor kind of appears to be powerful, right? Like maybe your prayer is answered, then that might mean that they have more power than you originally had thought. And maybe you can connect with them further away or in a different context than you normally would. It really depends on what the individual or the family's experience is with that deity, with that ancestor, with that ghost.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions about all of that?
When it says that candles are lit at altars to lost loved ones, is there a purpose for that, or just to pay homage?
I mean, so the ancestors are, I think the best term is venerated, which is somewhere between worshipped and honored. That they you have a responsibility as a member of Chinese society, as a family member, to take care of your past loved ones. And there's a lot of ways you do that. There are certain rituals that include, things like candles or other sacrifices or sweeping or any of those kinds of things. And you have kind of a duty to do that. And then you also do have an opportunity to ask for assistance from more benevolent ancestors. If you had a bad relationship with your aunt, she's not going to help you in the afterlife either. Right. So that's kind of, it's pretty straightforward when you think about it. When you just kind of take the straightforward logic about it. If you do very well, then you would hope that if you had a good relationship with that ancestor, that the ancestor might be able to, help you out somehow. I don't know that there's tons of deep theological conversation or writings about how that works or anything like that. I don't think there really is, but it is an important part of Chinese culture. The last study that I saw is over half practice some form of the folk religion as kind of their primary practice. Over half of China, and especially around rural areas. So I want to mention a couple of things. So firstly, this is a Taoist temple. And actually, let me go back. Lee, would you like to talk a little bit about any of your experiences in China? Since I have not been there, I only know what I've learned. Here's Lee still here.
My husband and I both went. So he's here too.
Oh,
and
yeah.
the dog is squeaking a squeaky toy. So could you mute her, please?
That's fine. It doesn't matter.
Okay. I think what we saw there with regarding religion and culture and things really reflects a lot of the things that you said. In that, for us, we were tourists, so we got to visit Taoist temples or places and Buddhist sites, and but then our guide sometimes would tell us stories from the folklore, in detail, on the way. So it's all kind of mixed up, and I don't think we got the impression, religion is so important in America, and I just didn't get that impression as much there. But, having these old, fabulous temples and places for these religions says something about the culture and valuing that past and the guidance that they received. I was trying to figure out how to come to enjoy this country and feel comfortable there because it's so different from America. So I read some books that, about the history a little bit, then also some books on mythology, because I thought that would go to some foundation of the culture. And it was so interesting because it really did come up. So the mythology being kind of like the folk religion, I think that you're talking about. The stories were told in depth and all. It was just really fascinating. It made me feel like I figured out what to do to prepare to go to China. That was nice.
That's good. Yeah. Religion just means a different thing in different places too. Okay, so I'm gonna go through a couple other little things here. So one thing, currently the Chinese government has 5 state-sanctioned religions, with caveats of sorts. And what that means is that they tend to have a little bit more religious freedom than religions that are not state-sanctioned. That does not mean they have religious freedom, but it does mean that they tend to be a little more ignored. Taoism and Buddhism, of course, are two of the largest religions. And you'll notice that Confucianism is not seen as a religion,
Yeah.
although there are people who identify as predominantly Confucian. It's just not considered a religion. And what tends to actually happen with Confucianism is that there's actually priests in Confucianism too, and they tend to be sort of the middle ground, sort of the, like, you know, in the United States, we get into some conflict about, you know, prayers at football games and things like that. Well, in China, what you probably see is if there was a prayer at all, which there probably won't be most of the time, it would probably be done by a Confucian minister, because it's kind of the middle ground. It's kind of seen as the secular enough option that is kind of endorsed by China in many ways. And then, so they separate Protestantism and Catholicism, and the asterisk here next to Catholicism is actually, what was that? Sorry. Catholicism's asterisk is actually about that they're not allowed to have a clear leadership connection to the Vatican. They are their own Catholic Church. They have the Chinese Catholic Church. So they're not allowed to have that same relationship that, like, the Catholic Church in the United States has to the Vatican. They are blocked from being that way. Obviously, there's still a lot of shared practices and everything, but officially they're not supposed to take direction from the Vatican, and you know, China can override a lot of what the Catholic Church does in China.
Does the Vatican recognize the Catholic presence in China?
I believe that they do see them as Catholic. They just kind of are separate enough to where they just can't really, you know, do a whole lot about, you know, unifying the Chinese Catholic Church with the rest of the Catholic Church. I don't know all the details on that, but yeah, I'm probably look more into it to understand it a little better. Again, you know, there's a very deep, especially right now, there's a very nationalist attitude in China by the government, and there's a lot of questions. You know, you'll notice Judaism isn't on here for multiple reasons. The main reason being that they're not very big on immigration, and there aren't a lot of Chinese Jewish people in China. But there's always a question if they feel that there's a possibility that the religious tradition, quote, takes orders from outside of China. That's why you don't see, you have a lot of persecution of Muslims because they have certain practices that are not seen as Chinese by the government, and you don't have Jewish people being protected by the Chinese government. The Catholic Church doesn't have a connection, and Protestantism doesn't have an overarching power, so they kind of enforce some kind of disconnect between Protestant churches in China from outside of China.
Jeremy?
Yeah.
I just want to mention, when we were there, we got to visit a synagogue that's set up as a memorial, and that Jews were welcomed in China around the time of World War II. That Chinese people saved them, gave them jobs, gave them a community. They're very proud of that, and they have pictures of how people were absorbed into the community and given jobs and positions.
Schindlers, they called them.
Yeah, my husband said it's a Chinese Schindler, but they were very active and welcoming. People went by the water or by land. Jews escaped into China with welcome.
That's good. Yeah, it gets complicated with with a lot of these, sorry, I had to mute you. It was rebounding. It gets complicated, and I'm not exactly sure how why China chooses these five. I mean, obviously there are other religious groups that are in China in general anyway, but my understanding is that this is fundamentally about, you know, both the size of the religion as well as you know, having unilateral freedom to practice in ways that other traditions might not. And I'm not like, with China, I mean, there's a lot of choices that are made that, like, I don't really understand why they decide to publicize some things and then persecute other things, and, you know, make all those decisions. I'm not sure. I do wish that they would actually have a real census on religion in China, because that's something that we don't really have very good statistics for. In particular, is, you know, what are people identifying as, what are people practicing. Most of the research is kind of it has to be internal, and religion is not something that they really are a big fan of researching in China. But I think that's very good and very interesting that that they've been pretty open with Jewish people after the Holocaust in particular. I hope that they learn from that positive relationship to support, you know, some of these other religious minorities in China that are, you know, I mean, like I said, the Uyghur Muslims are being just straight put up in work camps, you know, and like professors are being basically kidnapped to be put in those, and I don't really understand why it's that extreme, but yeah. So I'd like to firstly ask if there are any other questions or comments or anything like that about religious culture in China. Sorry.
A great overview. I'm wondering if there are sort of food traditions of any kind with any of these things, that either food left for ancestors as part of a sacrifice, or just communal food things that they do as part of the religion.
Mm-hmm. So depending on the type of Buddhism, you have quite a bit of vegetarianism in Buddhism, by people who practice it as like a true, complete religious tradition, especially people who are monks or nuns in the Buddhist tradition. But I don't know a ton about it. I mean, the main thing that I know culturally is that pork has a very central importance to China, and that they are very critical of ethnically Chinese people who refuse to eat it. And I haven't quite understood exactly why that happens, why that is so important. And that's not the only reason, I'm sure, but for like the persecution against the Uyghurs, but I know that that's a pretty important reason. But yeah, I mean, when they give to the ancestors, there's definitely an emphasis on what the ancestor would have liked, and a lot of it tends to be not super expensive, not super complicated. You know, like if they like oranges, you give them an orange. You don't generally make them a full meal.
Jeremy,
Uh-huh.
in this country and in European countries, many of them, they tell us that the number of people who identify as religious is going down and down. Is there any indication of that in these religions?
So, I mean, China's population does not see itself as very religious in the first place. And it went down pretty dramatically since Mao Zedong got power in China. My understanding is, yes, in general, not only is there fewer and fewer people affiliating with religion, but there's also fewer and fewer people upholding some of those rituals that they wouldn't have considered religious. You know, kind of like, you know, going back to sweep the graves might not be as important to this generation of young Chinese people, especially those who end up leaving to go to college and things like that. A lot of them just, you know, some move back, some stay here, some go to other countries, and a lot of them kind of don't bother with a lot of those traditions. So I'm interested in, after we've learned about these four, do you see these as religious? Do you see all of them as religious? Do you see just a few of them as religious? Or none of them?
I think they're just so unlike American religions. You know, they're all so unique. And, you know, for some reason, Americans, maybe all religious attendance and everything is down everywhere. But there's such involvement in religions in this country that are, you know, based on one God. I think these things are different than that. They all have elements of folk kind of thoughts to me in them, and wisdom more than God or deity.
And much more cultural and sort of ritual tradition or something, and not worship as we would think of it here in our culture.
Yeah.
The other thing is Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism tend to be looking back, you know, where Christianity, you know, and Islam tend to look forward to a reward or whatever you may have it. But yeah, no deity, no looking forward. It's more of a philosophy, I think these are. I'm not sure about the folk religion, but.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing I want to make sure you all leave with is that, you know, Buddhism in general doesn't teach about gods and goddesses, but that gets really complicated if you believe that, you know, the folk religion can be practiced alongside the Buddhism, and they're not really that separate. You know, that Buddhism kind of gains gods from the folk religion, and the, you know, the folk religion kind of gains philosophies from these other three.
I think the folk religions seem closer to what I'm used to thinking of as a religion than any of the others, which is kind of funny.
Yeah. No, I think you have a good point. All of these traditions have temples. All of these traditions have religious leaders. They don't all have the same kind of like community support as like, you know, American churches and stuff, but they have some of those pieces of that a lot of people say are part of being a religion.
Mhm.
It still brings me back to spiritual and religious, what that meaning really is. And if it's rules that an organization of some kind have set up, to me, that's religion. But spiritual is the belief behind it, or I can't explain that very well.
Yeah.
But I look at some of these, it seem like a combination of spiritual and tradition or culture, rather than religion, like you think of Presbyterian, has an outline of what they believe and the way people are supposed to do it. And
Mhm.
this doesn't feel like that to me.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, if anyone else has any questions, I'm happy to answer. I could add one little thing about Confucianism that I didn't put in the slideshow. I wasn't quite sure how much time I'd have, since we have just a couple minutes. I just wanted to also mention that this same controversy about whether Confucianism is a religion happened in the 16th century, I believe, or 17th century, with Catholicism. They also had a thing called the Chinese Rites, RITES, Chinese Rites controversy. And that was a time where the Jesuits argued that Confucianism could be practiced alongside Catholicism, and the Franciscans argued, no, it's too close to religion, to Catholicism. We can't allow it to be practiced alongside. They ended up first saying no to it. The Catholic Church said no to it, and then they reversed it later. But I thought that was kind of an interesting point, that people have been arguing about that for hundreds of years already, you know. So yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for joining me, and I think next time we will be going over Buddhism a little more deeply. Like I said, you know, I wanted to make sure that everyone had kind of a basic idea of how, you know, kind of the Chinese religious culture works, how there's kind of this, you know, there's a little bit of a blur between the sacred and the profane, and the you know, ritual versus tradition versus religion versus spirituality and philosophy and culture. All those things are kind of gray, at least as I read them. So when we talk about Buddhism, we should know that that just because we're talking about one school of thought doesn't mean it's the only thing that people are thinking about as they you know, go through their daily lives. Okay, so thank you again.
You,
Hope you all come back next time.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah,
We go.
thank you.
Always interesting.
Good class. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good one. Thank you for your for the story, Lee, by the way.